Welcome, dear listener, to another peaceful journey through the corridors of history. Tonight, we embark on a voyage across the vast Atlantic Ocean, following in the wake of one of history's most consequential figures, Christopher Columbus. As you settle into your comfortable position, allow the gentle rhythm of ocean waves to carry you away from the concerns of today and into the remarkable world of the late 15th century. Close your eyes and imagine the soft creaking of wooden ships, the whisper of wind through canvas sails, and the endless expanse of blue water stretching toward an unknown horizon. Tonight, we will sail alongside a man whose courage, determination, and vision would forever change the course of human history. This is not just the story of geographical discovery, but a tale of human ambition, faith, and the eternal quest to explore the unknown. Let your breathing slow and deepen as we begin our journey. Feel the gentle rocking motion of a ship at sea, the salt air filling your lungs, and the warm Mediterranean sun on your face. We are about to discover not just new lands, but new perspectives on courage, perseverance, and the power of believing in one's dreams against all odds. Our story begins in the bustling maritime city of Genoa, where the sound of hammers on ship hulls mingles with the cries of seagulls, and where a young boy named Cristoforo Colombo first heard the call of the sea. Chapter 1: Child of the Sea, Genoa, 1451 to 1470. In the year 1451, as the last echoes of the medieval world were giving way to the bright dawn of the Renaissance, a child was born in the Republic of Genoa who would one day bridge two worlds. The narrow, winding streets of this ancient maritime city echoed with the sounds of commerce and craftsmanship, where the scent of the sea mingled with the aroma of spices from distant lands. Christopher Columbus, known in his native tongue as Cristoforo Colombo, entered the world in a modest stone house near the city's ancient walls. His father, Domenico Colombo, was a wool weaver and tavern keeper, a man of humble means but honest character. His mother, Susanna Fontanarossa, came from a family with modest connections to the sea trade. The Columbus family was neither wealthy nor noble, but they possessed something perhaps more valuable: the industrious spirit of Genoa's merchant class and an intimate connection to the maritime world that surrounded them. From his earliest memories, young Christopher was surrounded by the sights, sounds, and stories of the sea. Genoa in the 15th century was one of Europe's great maritime powers, its harbour filled with vessels from across the Mediterranean and beyond. The boy would often wander down to the bustling port, where ships arrived daily carrying silk from the east, gold from Africa, and tales of distant lands that fired his imagination. The narrow streets of Genoa's old quarter were like a living map of the known world. Here, a Venetian merchant might haggle with a Byzantine trader over the price of precious stones. There, a weather-beaten captain might regale tavern patrons with stories of storms weathered and fortunes made in distant ports. Young Christopher absorbed these stories like a sponge, his mind already beginning to map the possibilities that lay beyond the horizon. His formal education was limited, as was common for children of his social class. But Christopher possessed an insatiable curiosity about the world. He learned to read and write in Latin, the language of scholarship and international commerce. More importantly, he began to understand the basics of navigation, mathematics, and geography, skills that would prove invaluable in his future endeavors. The boy's imagination was particularly captured by the stories of Marco Polo, whose travels to the court of Kublai Khan had been recorded in a book that circulated among Genoa's educated merchants. These tales of the fabulous wealth of Cathay and the Indies planted seeds in Christopher's mind that would eventually grow into his grand vision of reaching the East by sailing west. As Christopher grew into adolescence, he began to accompany his father on business trips along the Ligurian coast. These journeys gave him his first real taste of life at sea, and he discovered that he possessed both a natural aptitude for seamanship and an iron stomach that served him well in rough weather. The rhythmic motion of the waves, which made many landlubbers queasy, seemed to calm and center the young man. By his late teens, Christopher had grown into a tall, red-haired young man with piercing blue eyes that seemed always to be gazing toward some distant horizon. His hands, already calloused from rope work and sail handling, spoke of countless hours spent learning the mariner's craft. He had developed the characteristic rolling gait of an experienced sailor, and his weather-beaten face bore the marks of sun and salt spray. The young Columbus was known among Genoa's maritime community as a skilled navigator and a reliable crew member. He had an almost mystical ability to read the signs of weather and sea, and his fellow sailors often remarked on his uncanny sense of direction. But perhaps more importantly, he had begun to develop the unwavering self-confidence that would later enable him to persist in the face of repeated rejections and setbacks. During these formative years, Christopher also began to develop his deep religious faith, which would remain a constant throughout his life. He saw his growing expertise as a navigator not merely as a practical skill, but as a calling from God. In his mind, the ability to traverse the trackless ocean was a divine gift, and he began to believe that he was destined for some great purpose that would serve both God and humanity. As the 1470s dawned, Christopher Columbus stood on the threshold of manhood, his character already formed by the unique combination of Genoese commercial pragmatism and maritime mysticism. The boy who had once gazed wonderingly at the ships in Genoa's harbor was now ready to command vessels of his own and to pursue the grand vision that was beginning to take shape in his mind. The sea had called to him since childhood, and now he was ready to answer that call in ways that would astonish the world. Chapter 2: The Making of a Mariner. First Voyages, 1470 to 1485. As the morning mist lifted from the harbor of Genoa in the early 1470s, a young Christopher Columbus stood ready to embark on the next phase of his education, not in the classrooms of scholars, but on the rolling decks of merchant vessels that would carry him across the Mediterranean and beyond. The transition from apprentice to accomplished mariner would prove to be both exhilarating and perilous, shaping not only his skills as a navigator, but also his understanding of the vast world that lay beyond the familiar waters of his homeland. His first significant voyage took him eastward to the island of Chios in the Aegean Sea, a Genoese trading post where the precious mastic resin was harvested. The journey was a revelation for the young sailor. As their vessel cut through the azure waters of the Mediterranean, Columbus experienced for the first time the profound sense of freedom that comes from being truly at sea, with no land visible in any direction. The endless expanse of water, the play of light on the waves, and the vast dome of sky overhead filled him with a sense of wonder that would never leave him. On Chios, Columbus encountered merchants and sailors from across the eastern Mediterranean, Greeks, Turks, Arabs, and Armenians, each with their own stories of distant lands and profitable trade routes. He learned that the spices, silks, and precious stones that commanded such high prices in European markets came from places so distant that their very names seemed like incantations: Ceylon, Malacca, Cathay, Kipangu. The young mariner began to understand that the world was far larger and more complex than he had ever imagined. The return voyage to Genoa was marked by Columbus's first experience of a serious storm at sea. As their ship was battered by mountainous waves and howling winds, many of the crew despaired of ever seeing land again. But Columbus found himself strangely exhilarated by the tempest. Rather than cowering below decks, he remained on watch, studying the behavior of wind and wave, learning to read the subtle signs that might mean the difference between life and death in future voyages. This experience taught him a crucial lesson that would serve him well in years to come: that the sea, for all its beauty and majesty, was also a stern teacher that demanded respect, skill, and unwavering courage. Those who approached it with arrogance or carelessness would find themselves humbled, while those who learned its lessons and respected its power might find in it a pathway to unimaginable opportunities. Following his successful return from the eastern Mediterranean, Columbus began to seek out more challenging and lucrative voyages. The 1470s were a time of expanding horizons for European mariners, as improvements in ship design and navigation techniques made longer voyages increasingly feasible. The young Genoese sailor was eager to be part of this maritime revolution. His next significant journey took him northward to England and possibly as far as Iceland. This voyage opened his eyes to an entirely different maritime world. The grey, storm-tossed waters of the North Atlantic were a far cry from the sun-drenched Mediterranean, and the hardy Norse and English sailors he encountered had their own traditions and techniques that differed markedly from those of the Mediterranean world. In England, Columbus may have heard stories of earlier Norse voyages to lands far to the west, tales of Leif Erikson and the mysterious Vinland that lay beyond the Western Ocean. Whether these stories made a conscious impression on him at the time is uncertain, but they may have planted seeds that would later contribute to his growing conviction that land lay within reach across the Atlantic. The northern voyage also introduced Columbus to the challenges of navigation in waters where the familiar Mediterranean landmarks were absent. He learned to rely more heavily on celestial navigation, using the positions of stars and the sun to determine his location. This experience would prove invaluable when he later ventured into the uncharted waters of the Atlantic. Perhaps most importantly, the voyage to northern waters gave Columbus his first real taste of ocean sailing, as opposed to the coastal navigation that characterized most Mediterranean voyages. The experience of being truly out of sight of land for days at a time, with nothing but the compass and the stars to guide him, was both terrifying and exhilarating. It was during these long watches under the northern stars that Columbus began to develop the almost mystical confidence in his navigational abilities that would later enable him to convince others to follow him into the unknown. Upon his return to the Mediterranean, Columbus found himself increasingly drawn to the Portuguese, who were at the forefront of maritime exploration. Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator had established a school of navigation and had been systematically pushing Portuguese exploration southward along the African coast. The Portuguese had developed new techniques in ship design, navigation, and cartography that made them the acknowledged leaders in oceanic exploration. In the late 1470s, Columbus made the fateful decision to relocate to Lisbon, the bustling capital of Portugal's growing maritime empire. The city was a magnet for ambitious sailors, navigators, and merchants from across Europe, all drawn by the opportunities presented by Portugal's expanding trade networks and exploration efforts. Lisbon in the 1470s was a city alive with possibility and discovery. The harbour was filled with caravels returning from voyages down the African coast, their holds filled with gold, ivory, and slaves. The streets buzzed with talk of new lands discovered, new trade routes opened, and new fortunes made. For an ambitious young mariner like Columbus, it was the perfect place to hone his skills and develop his grand vision. In Lisbon, Columbus married Filipa Perestrello e Moniz, the daughter of a Portuguese nobleman who had been one of the early colonizers of the Atlantic islands. Through this marriage, Columbus gained access to Portuguese maritime circles and, perhaps more importantly, to charts and documents that detailed Portuguese discoveries in the Atlantic. His wife's family had been involved in the exploration and settlement of the Madeira Islands, and Columbus was able to study their experiences in establishing colonies on previously uninhabited Atlantic islands. The marriage also provided Columbus with a base of operations and a degree of social respectability that would prove crucial in his later efforts to gain royal support for his voyages. As the 1480s dawned, Christopher Columbus had transformed himself from a humble Genoese wool weaver's son into a skilled navigator, experienced ocean sailor, and member of the Portuguese maritime establishment. But even as he achieved this success, a grander vision was taking shape in his mind. A vision that would soon set him on a collision course with conventional wisdom and ultimately change the course of world history. Chapter 3: The Grand Design. Conceiving the Westward Route, 1485 to 1492. As the 1480s unfolded in Lisbon, Christopher Columbus found himself at the center of the most exciting period of geographical discovery in human history. Portuguese navigators were steadily pushing southward along the African coast, each voyage bringing them closer to their ultimate goal of finding a sea route to the Indies. The air in Lisbon's maritime quarter was thick with anticipation and possibility, as merchants, navigators, and royal officials discussed the latest discoveries and planned ever more ambitious expeditions. Yet even as Columbus participated in this atmosphere of discovery, his mind was increasingly occupied by a radically different approach to the problem of reaching the Indies. While his Portuguese colleagues focused their attention on the long route around Africa, Columbus began to develop an audacious alternative. Why not sail directly west across the Atlantic to reach the lands of spice and gold that lay beyond? The idea was not entirely original. Ancient Greek geographers had speculated about the possibility of reaching the east by sailing west, and medieval scholars had occasionally discussed the theoretical possibility. But Columbus was perhaps the first person to seriously consider the practical feasibility of such a voyage and to develop a detailed plan for accomplishing it. His conviction was based on a combination of geographical theories, mathematical calculations, and what can only be described as divine inspiration. Columbus had studied the works of ancient geographers like Ptolemy and Strabo, as well as more recent scholars like Pierre d'Ailly and Paolo Toscanelli. From these sources, he constructed a vision of the world that, while ultimately incorrect in its details, was sufficiently plausible to convince him that a westward voyage to the Indies was not only possible, but practical. The key to Columbus's calculations was his estimate of the size of the Earth and the extent of the Eurasian landmass. Based on his reading of various geographical authorities, he concluded that the Earth was significantly smaller than it actually is, and that the continent of Asia extended much farther eastward than was actually the case. These two errors, when combined, led him to believe that the distance from Europe to Asia by the western route was only about 3,000 miles, a challenging but manageable voyage for the ships of his day. In reality, the distance from Europe to Asia across the Pacific is more than 12,000 miles, a journey that would have been impossible for 15th century vessels. Columbus's miscalculations were fortunate errors that made his voyage seem feasible when it would otherwise have appeared hopeless. Had he known the true dimensions of the Earth and the extent of the Pacific Ocean, he might never have attempted his historic voyage. But Columbus's vision was based on more than mere geographical speculation. He was also influenced by his deep religious faith, which convinced him that God had chosen him for a special mission. He believed that the discovery of a western route to the Indies would not only bring great wealth to Christian Europe, but would also open new opportunities for spreading the gospel to the peoples of the East. In his mind, the voyage was not merely a commercial venture, but a crusade that would serve the greater glory of God. This religious dimension of Columbus's vision was crucial to his ability to persist in the face of repeated rejections and setbacks. When learned men dismissed his calculations as fantasy and practical sailors declared his plan impossible, Columbus's faith sustained him. He was convinced that God would not have placed such a vision in his heart unless he intended for it to be fulfilled. The development of Columbus's plan was also influenced by his practical experience as a navigator and his observations of natural phenomena that seemed to support his theories. During his voyages in the Atlantic, he had noticed that westerly winds often brought strange objects to European shores: carved wood, unfamiliar plants, and even the bodies of men whose features suggested they came from unknown lands. These observations convinced him that inhabited lands lay not far to the west. Columbus also studied the flight patterns of birds, noting that certain species seemed to migrate westward in the autumn, suggesting the presence of land in that direction. He observed the behavior of ocean currents and the patterns of cloud formation, all of which seemed to support his conviction that the Western Ocean was not an endless void, but a navigable sea that led to inhabited shores. As his vision crystallized, Columbus began the long and frustrating process of seeking royal patronage for his proposed voyage. In the 15th century, only monarchs possessed the resources necessary to finance major voyages of exploration, and Columbus would need not only ships and supplies, but also the legal authority to claim any lands he might discover. His first approach was to King John II of Portugal, the monarch who had done more than any other to promote oceanic exploration. Columbus presented his plan to the Portuguese court with great confidence, expecting that a nation so committed to maritime discovery would eagerly embrace his innovative approach to reaching the Indies. To his dismay, the Portuguese Royal Commission that evaluated his proposal rejected it decisively. The learned men who advised King John II found Columbus's geographical calculations unconvincing and his estimates of distance wildly optimistic. Moreover, Portugal was already heavily invested in the African route to the Indies, and Bartolomeu Dias had recently rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that the eastern route was feasible. The rejection by Portugal was a crushing blow to Columbus, but it did not shake his fundamental conviction that his plan was sound. Instead, he began to look elsewhere for the support he needed. Over the next several years, he would approach the courts of England, France, and Spain, seeking a monarch with the vision and courage to support his grand design. The years of seeking patronage were marked by poverty, frustration, and repeated disappointment. Columbus was forced to support himself and his young son Diego through a variety of occupations, including map-making and bookselling. Yet throughout this difficult period, he never wavered in his belief that God had chosen him to open a new route to the Indies. As the 1480s drew to a close, Columbus's persistence finally began to bear fruit. The Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, fresh from their victory over the last Muslim stronghold in Granada, were looking for new ways to compete with Portugal's growing dominance in overseas trade. Columbus's proposal, which had seemed like fantasy to the Portuguese, began to look like an opportunity to the Spanish. The negotiations with the Spanish court were long and complex, involving not only the practical details of financing and equipping the voyage, but also the terms under which Columbus would govern any lands he might discover. Columbus's demands were audacious. He wanted to be appointed Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of any lands he discovered, and entitled to a percentage of all profits from trade with the new territories. Many at the Spanish court thought Columbus's demands were presumptuous, but Queen Isabella was intrigued by both the man and his vision. She saw in Columbus a combination of practical skill and divine inspiration that might indeed open new worlds to Spanish influence. After months of negotiation, she finally agreed to support his voyage. On April 17, 1492, Columbus signed the Capitulations of Santa Fe, the agreement that would make his voyage possible. As he affixed his signature to the document, he could hardly have imagined that he was about to embark on a journey that would not only fulfill his personal dreams, but would fundamentally alter the course of human history. The boy who had once gazed at ships in Genoa's harbor was finally ready to command his own fleet and to sail into the unknown in pursuit of his grand design. Chapter 4: Into the Unknown. The First Voyage, 1492 to 1493. The dawn of August 3rd, 1492, broke clear and bright over the small port of Palos de la Frontera on Spain's Atlantic coast. As the first rays of sunlight painted the harbor waters gold, 3 ships rode at anchor, their crews making final preparations for a voyage that would change the world forever. The largest vessel, the Santa Maria, served as the flagship under Columbus's direct command. Accompanying her were 2 smaller caravels, the Pinta and the Niña, each carrying crews of experienced Andalusian sailors who had agreed to follow their Genoese admiral into the vast unknown of the Western Ocean. The atmosphere in Palos that morning was a mixture of excitement, apprehension, and solemnity. Many of the townspeople had gathered to witness the departure, some to bid farewell to sons and brothers who might never return, others simply to observe what many believed might be the last anyone would see of Columbus and his men. The prevailing opinion among the learned was that the 3 ships were sailing to their doom in the trackless wastes of the ocean sea. Columbus himself stood on the deck of the Santa Maria, his tall figure silhouetted against the morning sky. At 41 years of age, he was at the height of his powers as a navigator and leader of men. His red hair had begun to show traces of grey, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who had spent decades at sea, but his blue eyes burned with the intensity of absolute conviction. This was the moment he had dreamed of since his youth in Genoa, the culmination of years of planning, negotiation, and unwavering faith in his vision. As the tide turned and the wind shifted to favor their departure, Columbus gave the order to weigh anchor. The 3 ships slowly made their way out of Palos harbor, their sails filling with the morning breeze. Behind them, the familiar coastline of Spain gradually faded into the distance. Ahead lay the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean and whatever mysteries it might hold. The first leg of the voyage took the small fleet to the Canary Islands, Spain's westernmost outposts in the Atlantic. This was familiar territory for Columbus, who had visited the islands on previous voyages. The stop in the Canaries served both practical and psychological purposes. It allowed the crews to take on fresh water and supplies, and it provided a final taste of civilization before venturing into the true unknown. During the week-long stay in the Canaries, Columbus made final adjustments to his ships and equipment. The Pinta's rudder was repaired, and the Niña's lateen sails were replaced with square-rigged sails that would be more efficient for ocean sailing. More importantly, Columbus used this time to bolster the morale of his men, many of whom were beginning to have second thoughts about the wisdom of their enterprise. On September 6, 1492, the 3 ships departed the Canary Islands and set course due west into the open Atlantic. As the last traces of land disappeared below the horizon, Columbus and his men found themselves in a situation that no Europeans had ever experienced, sailing westward into an ocean that, as far as they knew, had no end. The early days of the ocean crossing were marked by favorable winds and good weather. The ships made steady progress westward, covering between 150 and 200 miles each day. Columbus maintained 2 logs of their progress, one accurate record for his own use, and another that understated their distance from Spain, which he shared with the crew to prevent them from becoming too alarmed at how far they had traveled from home. As the days turned into weeks, however, the psychological strain of the voyage began to tell on the crews. They were sailing through waters that no Christian had ever seen, guided only by their admiral's unshakable conviction that land lay somewhere ahead. The ocean seemed endless, stretching to the horizon in every direction, without the slightest sign of the Indies that Columbus had promised they would find. The men began to notice strange phenomena that both fascinated and frightened them. They observed that the compass needle no longer pointed true north, but seemed to vary from day to day. Columbus explained this magnetic variation as a natural phenomenon, but many of the sailors saw it as evidence that they had sailed beyond the normal bounds of the world into regions where the very laws of nature might not apply. They also encountered vast mats of floating seaweed, unlike anything they had seen in European waters. Columbus identified this as sargassum and assured his men that it indicated the presence of land nearby. But as day after day passed without any sight of shore, the crews began to grow restless and fearful. By early October, the expedition had been at sea for more than a month, and murmurs of discontent were growing among the sailors. Some began to speak openly of turning back, arguing that they had already sailed farther west than any men in history, and that to continue would be to court certain death. Columbus found himself in the delicate position of maintaining discipline and morale while pushing his men to continue toward a goal that seemed increasingly elusive. The admiral's response to this crisis was characteristic of his leadership style throughout the voyage. He combined practical concessions with inspirational rhetoric, acknowledging his men's concerns while never wavering in his own conviction that success lay just ahead. He agreed to turn back if they did not sight land within 3 days, but he also reminded them of the wealth and glory that awaited them if they persevered. On the night of October 11th, as the 3 ships continued their westward course under a bright moon, the signs that land was near began to multiply. The crews observed birds flying overhead, floating branches with fresh leaves, and other debris that suggested the proximity of shore. Columbus himself thought he saw a light in the distance, though others were unable to confirm the sighting. At 2 o'clock in the morning of October the 12th, 1492, the lookout aboard the Pinta, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana, called out the words that would echo through history. Tierra. Tierra. Land. Land! After 36 days at sea, Columbus and his men had finally reached their destination. As dawn broke, the 3 ships approached a small island that the native inhabitants called Guanahani. Columbus named it San Salvador and claimed it for the Spanish crown. The island was inhabited by a people whom Columbus called Indians, believing that he had reached the Indies as planned. These native people, whom we now know as the Taino, greeted the Europeans with curiosity and hospitality, offering gifts of parrots, cotton thread, and other local products. Columbus was struck by the gentleness and generosity of the native people, writing in his journal that they would make excellent servants and could easily be converted to Christianity. He was also impressed by their physical beauty, and their apparent innocence of the ways of the old world. Yet even as he marveled at these new people, his mind was focused on his primary objective, finding the gold and spices that would justify his voyage to his royal sponsors. The discovery of San Salvador was only the beginning of Columbus's exploration of what he believed to be the outer islands of the Indies. Over the next 3 months, he would explore the Caribbean, visiting Cuba, which he was convinced was part of the mainland of Asia, and Hispaniola, where he established the first European settlement in the New World. The return voyage to Spain was marked by storms and difficulties that nearly ended in disaster. The Santa Maria was wrecked on the coast of Hispaniola, forcing Columbus to leave some of his men behind to establish a colony. The remaining 2 ships barely survived a fierce storm in the Atlantic, and Columbus feared that his discoveries might die with him if he failed to reach Spain safely. But on March 15, 1493, the Niña and the Pinta sailed into Palace Harbor, completing one of the most momentous voyages in human history. Columbus had not found the Indies as he had intended, but he had discovered something far more significant: an entirely new world that would transform the course of human civilization. As news of the discovery spread across Europe, Columbus found himself transformed from an obscure Genoese navigator into one of the most famous men in the world. He had achieved his dream of opening a western route across the ocean, though the lands he had found were far different from what he had expected to discover. The boy who had once listened to tales of distant lands in the taverns of Genoa had become the man who opened those distant lands to European exploration and settlement. Chapter 5: Admiral of the Ocean Sea, The Later Voyages, 1493 to 1504. The triumphant return of Christopher Columbus to Spain in March 1493 marked not the end of his story, but rather the beginning of a new and more complex chapter in his remarkable life. The man who had departed Palos as an ambitious but relatively unknown navigator returned as the Admiral of the Ocean Sea, bearing news of discoveries that would reshape European understanding of the world. Yet even as he basked in the glory of his achievement, Columbus was already planning his return to the lands he had discovered, driven by an unquenchable desire to explore further and to find the mainland of Asia that he was convinced lay just beyond the islands he had visited. The reception that awaited Columbus at the Spanish court was nothing short of magnificent. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella received him with honors befitting a conquering hero, and the exotic artifacts he had brought back from the New World, including several native people who had agreed to accompany him, created a sensation among the Spanish nobility. The parrots, gold ornaments, and strange plants that Columbus displayed seemed to confirm that he had indeed reached the fabled Indies, and the Spanish monarchs were eager to capitalize on their navigator's success. The planning for Columbus's second voyage began almost immediately, but this time the scale and objectives were far more ambitious than those of the first expedition. Where the initial voyage had been essentially a reconnaissance mission with 3 small ships and 90 men, the second voyage would be a full-scale colonization effort involving 17 ships and more than 200 men. The fleet included not only sailors and soldiers, but also craftsmen, farmers, and clergy who would establish permanent Spanish settlements in the New World. Columbus's second voyage departed from Cadiz on September 25, 1493, with the admiral once again serving as the expedition's leader. The crossing was swifter than the first, taking only 21 days to reach the Caribbean. This time, Columbus followed a more southerly route that brought him to the Lesser Antilles, allowing him to explore a chain of islands that he had missed on his first voyage. The discoveries of the second voyage were remarkable in their scope and variety. Columbus explored dozens of new islands, including Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. He also spent considerable time on Hispaniola, where he found that the settlement he had left behind had been destroyed and its inhabitants killed in conflicts with the native population. This sobering discovery provided Columbus with his first real indication that the relationship between Europeans and the indigenous peoples of the New World would not be as harmonious as he had initially hoped. The establishment of new settlements on Hispaniola proved to be far more challenging than Columbus had anticipated. The Spanish colonists, many of whom had come to the New World expecting to find easy wealth, were ill prepared for the hard work of building a colony from scratch. Disease, hunger, and conflicts with the native population took a heavy toll, and Columbus found himself spending much of his time dealing with administrative problems rather than exploration. Despite these challenges, Columbus remained convinced that he was on the verge of reaching the mainland of Asia and the great cities described by Marco Polo. During his third voyage, which began in 1498, he finally reached the South American mainland, landing on the coast of what is now Venezuela. The sight of the great Orinoco River convinced him that he had discovered a continent of enormous size, though he continued to believe that it was part of Asia rather than an entirely separate landmass. The third voyage also marked the beginning of Columbus's decline as a colonial administrator. Reports reached Spain of mismanagement and brutality in the colonies under his governance, and the Spanish crown began to question whether the great navigator was equally suited to the task of governing the territories he had discovered. The indigenous population of Hispaniola had been decimated by disease and harsh treatment, and many Spanish colonists complained bitterly about Columbus's leadership. In 1500, Francisco de Bobadilla arrived in Hispaniola with royal authority to investigate the situation in the colonies. His findings were damning, and he ordered Columbus and his brothers to be arrested and sent back to Spain in chains. The sight of the Admiral of the Ocean Sea arriving in Spanish ports as a prisoner was a shocking reversal of fortune that demonstrated how quickly fame could turn to disgrace in the volatile world of 16th century politics. Although Queen Isabella ordered Columbus's immediate release and restored many of his honors, his reputation as a colonial administrator was permanently damaged. The Spanish crown began to look to other navigators and administrators to manage the growing empire in the New World, and Columbus found himself increasingly marginalized despite his historic achievements. Columbus's fourth and final voyage, undertaken between 1502 and 1504, was perhaps his most remarkable from a purely exploratory standpoint. Forbidden from returning to Hispaniola because of the controversies surrounding his governorship, Columbus instead explored the coast of Central America, searching for a passage that would lead him to the Indian Ocean and the Spice Islands beyond. He sailed along the coasts of Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama, coming tantalizingly close to discovering the Pacific Ocean that lay just beyond the narrow isthmus. The fourth voyage was marked by extraordinary hardships that tested Columbus's skills as a navigator and leader to their limits. His ships were damaged by storms and riddled with shipworms, forcing him to beach them on the coast of Jamaica, where he and his men were stranded for more than a year. During this period, Columbus demonstrated remarkable resourcefulness, using his knowledge of astronomy to predict a lunar eclipse and thereby convince the local inhabitants to provide his men with food and supplies. The rescue of Columbus and his men from Jamaica in 1504 marked the end of his career as an active explorer. He returned to Spain to find that Queen Isabella, his most important patron, was dying, and that the new political climate was less favorable to his ambitions. Columbus spent his final years pursuing legal claims to the wealth and honors that he believed were rightfully his, but he never again commanded a fleet or set foot in the lands he had discovered. Throughout his later voyages, Columbus maintained his conviction that he had reached the Indies and that the mainland of Asia lay just beyond the territories he had explored. This belief, which seems almost willfully blind to modern observers, was actually quite reasonable given the geographical knowledge of his time. Columbus had no way of knowing that he had discovered an entirely new continent, and his interpretation of his discoveries was consistent with the best geographical theories of the late 15th century. The later voyages also revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Columbus as a leader and administrator. His skills as a navigator and explorer were unquestionable. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to find his way across trackless oceans and to discover new lands where others saw only empty water. But his talents did not extend to the complex tasks of colonial administration, and his treatment of both Spanish colonists and indigenous peoples often fell short of the standards expected by his royal sponsors. As Columbus's active career drew to a close, the full significance of his discoveries was only beginning to be understood. Other navigators, including Amerigo Vespucci and Vasco Núñez de Balboa, would soon prove that the lands Columbus had found were indeed a new continent rather than part of Asia. The name America would be applied to these new lands rather than Columbia, as might have been expected. But Columbus's role as the discoverer of the New World was never seriously disputed. The Admiral of the Ocean Sea had opened a door between two worlds that had been separated for millennia, setting in motion a process of cultural exchange, colonization, and transformation that would reshape both the old world and the new in ways that Columbus himself could never have imagined. Chapter 6: The Final Years. Legacy and Reflection, 1504 to 1506. As the year 1504 drew to a close, Christopher Columbus found himself in a position that would have seemed impossible during the height of his fame just a decade earlier. The man who had once been hailed as the Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the discoverer of new worlds, and the opener of western routes to the Indies, now lived in relative obscurity in the Spanish city of Valladolid. His health was failing, his legal battles with the Spanish crown seemed endless, and the new lands he had discovered were being explored and settled by other men who received the credit and rewards that he believed should rightfully be his. Yet even in these twilight years, Columbus remained fundamentally unchanged from the visionary navigator who had first conceived the audacious plan of reaching the Indies by sailing west. His faith in his own destiny remained unshaken, and he continued to believe that God had chosen him for a special purpose that extended far beyond mere geographical discovery. In his correspondence from this period, he wrote extensively about his conviction that his voyages had been part of a divine plan to spread Christianity to the peoples of the world and to gather the wealth necessary for a new crusade to reclaim the Holy Land. The physical toll of 4 voyages across the Atlantic and years of hardship in the New World had left Columbus a shadow of his former self. The man who had once possessed the iron constitution necessary to endure months at sea now suffered from arthritis, failing eyesight, and what appears to have been a form of reactive arthritis that left him bedridden for weeks at a time. His red hair had turned completely white, and his once piercing blue eyes were dimmed by age and illness. Despite his physical decline, Columbus's mind remained sharp, and he spent much of his time writing detailed accounts of his voyages and discoveries. These writings reveal a man who was simultaneously proud of his achievements and frustrated by what he saw as the world's failure to recognize their true significance. He continued to insist that he had reached the Indies and that the lands he had discovered were part of the Asian continent described by ancient geographers and medieval travelers like Marco Polo. This insistence on the Asian identity of his discoveries was not merely stubborn pride, but reflected Columbus's deep commitment to the geographical theories that had originally inspired his voyages. To admit that he had discovered a new continent rather than reaching the Indies would have been to acknowledge that his fundamental understanding of the world's geography was flawed. For a man whose entire identity was built around his role as a navigator and geographical theorist, such an admission would have been psychologically devastating. Columbus's final years were also marked by ongoing legal disputes with the Spanish crown over the terms of the original agreement that had made his voyages possible. The capitulations of Santa Fe had promised him significant privileges and a share of the wealth generated by his discoveries, but the Spanish government had gradually eroded these rights as the true extent and value of the New World became apparent. Columbus and his heirs would spend decades pursuing these claims through the Spanish legal system with mixed success. The legal battles were not merely about money, though Columbus certainly felt that he deserved compensation for his role in opening the New World to Spanish colonization. More fundamentally, they were about recognition and legacy. Columbus wanted history to remember him not just as a lucky navigator who had stumbled upon unknown lands, but as a visionary whose careful planning and divine inspiration had deliberately opened a new chapter in human history. During these final years, Columbus also grappled with the moral implications of the changes that his discoveries had set in motion. Reports from the New World told of the devastating impact of European diseases on indigenous populations, the brutal treatment of native peoples by Spanish colonists, and the establishment of systems of forced labor that bore little resemblance to the peaceful conversion to Christianity that Columbus had originally envisioned. These developments troubled Columbus deeply, though he never fully accepted responsibility for the negative consequences of European colonization. In his mind, the problems in the New World stemmed from the failure of later administrators to follow his example of relatively benevolent treatment of indigenous peoples. He